Hey listener, thanks for joining us today. Today's guest is Tom Akel, one of the most connected and influential leaders in the comic industry. The projects he's touched over his career have come to delight fans over every medium imaginable, from producing Jersey Shore at MTV to leading Webtoon's stunning expansion as its former editor-in-chief, and now helping digitally native comics physically get into the hands of fans all over the world as the CEO of Rocketship Entertainment. We talked through his decorated experience in the media space and how it has shaped how he thinks about content and helping creators today, learn about what it was like in the earliest days of Webtoon when it was forming its identity and he was shaping its portfolio of content, and talk through Rocketship's mission and what to expect from it this year and beyond. We learned a ton from our conversation with Tom and hope you enjoyed it too.
Hey Tom, how are you doing?
Good. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us. I'd love to dive right in. So tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do now at Rocketship.
I'm the CEO and co-founder of Rocketship Entertainment, which is primarily a graphic novel publishing company and tabletop publishing company. That is the majority of the work we put out are existing hit webcomics, and then there's various original titles that we do as well. We've expanded quite a bit in the last couple of years. We started in 2019 with a partner. My partner in the company is Robert Feldman, who's our CTO and head of product, who I go back with probably 20 years. We started basically on the thesis that a lot of these comics were having a hard time getting into print and that print publishers weren't really picking them up. Kind of started this in 2019 to see how it would go. And, we've basically been doing it since. In the last few years, picked up global distribution from Simon & Schuster, picked up a fantastic international agent in Jabberwocky, who also represent people like Charlene Harris and Brandon Sanderson and Webcomics. Have partnerships with Tapas and Legendary and Stanley's Power Entertainment, and probably more to come, I think, that I can't talk about yet, but soon.
Well, we're looking forward to those announcements. What got you into comics in the first place?
I feel like anybody in the industry, I grew up on them, right? So, very vivid memories of at first my parents giving me their comic collections of whatever they had lying around that survived their childhood, reading those, and then I think when we moved around a few times when I was young, really young, and then when we settled in where I grew up in my youth on Long Island. There was a comic shop opening up recently right up the street from our house. So that became a weekly destination, So it was there, begged my parents to take me in, and then just buying comics every week all the way through, from grade school to high school, all the way through, the big image boom and like everyone, Marvel, DC, and at the time, the indies then were like First Comics, a lot of Judge Dredd in 2000 AD stuff, wasn't a lot of manga in the States at that time, but certainly had the whole collection of Wolf and Cub. I feel like if you speak to anybody my age in comics, we're all going to have the same story about that.
Well, your career is very interesting. It's one of my favorite recent LinkedIn stocks. I just love how non-traditional it is and how many twists and turns it takes. And I'd love to understand how the beginning really influenced where you are now. So right out of school, from what I saw, you were a professor. Is that right?
Well, not exactly. So going back a million years, out of undergrad, I worked at, which isn't on my LinkedIn, even though I was there for a couple of years, I worked at Publishers Clearinghouse. It's just so long ago, I don't keep it on the resume anymore. But I was in marketing there, and it was sort of working there. And I really love the people I work with, but the work itself I didn't enjoy. And I think that was, and I knew I always loved content and entertainment, and I had double majored in marketing and film at Long Island University for undergrad. And after a couple of years of doing, being a marketing analyst, I realized I really, really hated it. I enjoyed doing marketing to some extent, but that as a career for me was not a fit, and I wound up leaving. But that was the first impetus for me to try to explore how to get back into entertainment. And then from there, took on odd jobs, taught myself HTML and web design and Photoshop and Illustrator just on the side before I could eventually build up enough of a portfolio to taking continuing ed classes and get into a school like Parsons. And then out of Parsons, I taught, but when I was teaching, that was at the same time as that I worked at Viacom.
How was your experience at Viacom? So it seems like you worked on a lot of mobile apps, mobile design at that time. What was that like?
That was awesome. I see a lot of parallels today in what's happening in technology to that time in the very like, nascent days of mobile media. Because when I started there, I was the first, you know, head of content for or senior producer, for lack of a better term, of mobile for a brand like that. Before that, there was just the my supervisors who had brought me in to Viacom were overseeing like kind of broad strokes of the business, getting deals done with Virgin Mobile back when that existed and things like that, and producing some content. And then I was the first dedicated producer to oversee a brand at Comedy Central. And you're talking like slide phones, flip phones. Snake was a popular game at the time. If you're, I mean, J2ME and Brew apps. I mean, this was super, super early days. So it was awesome. I mean, I love being, a part of, bleeding edge technology like that, especially as it, converges with content, because it was just every week was kind of something new. It was like, oh my God, the phones are going to have video capabilities now. Verizon Vcast is launching. What are we doing? Are we producing new stuff? Are we going to get the Daily Show on there? And then, what new games can we do? All right, the capabilities have increased, and across the board doing ringtones and everything, ringtones, wallpapers, SMS apps, IVR apps, Brew and J2ME apps and games. I produced the first ever streaming app, I think, in the US.
Wow.
It was a Brew and J2EM app for Comedy Central. It was called Comedy Central Takeout. And that was, super, super early on before, where we are now, obviously, where that's the dominant form of video consumption, right?
What was it like to be on the bleeding edge of technology and content? I guess maybe to start, what was it like working with all these different parties? Because I'm sure on the content side, people were like, well, TV and cable are the king for us right now. And you're looking at all these things that are coming out and thinking about the shift. So what was that like?
In any giant organization like that, you guys were at the Atlantic. It's sort of like it can be challenging and fun at the same time, right? Because you're spending a lot of time doing education to a lot of your colleagues who don't understand the space, and even though it was very, very successful and we're generating a lot of revenue for the company, it's still at the time, it is small in comparison to something like the scale of a network, right? And anything disruptive, which mobile was extraordinarily disruptive to the television industry, is going to be met with some level of resistance, right? So I wouldn't say like it wasn't that people didn't want to do this. Everyone was excited about it. It was always just sort of like, what's the balance, right, between what we're going to do here and what we're going to do online and what we're going to do on air. So navigating that, and especially with a big brand like that had at the time, a couple of mega hits on air, that becomes tough sometimes. Whereas like at Spike, a little easier because they frankly just didn't have the mega hits. So when at a smaller network, it was a little bit easier to sort of get people on board with like, well, let's try this. And everyone's like, yay, throw it at the wall. Yeah, and then the sort of the flip side to that was with the consumers, which this is another place where I see a lot of parallels with technology today, is that it's funny because I follow the NFT market, and particularly the ideas of the scams, right? And there's I think probably there's this, obviously everyone articulates this in sort of two schools. Is there's the scams around what NFTs are as just as a product and a monetary vehicle, and then there's people actually stealing other people's content and throwing it up as an NFT and selling it, and those which is those people should be prosecuted. But that reminds me very much of the early days of mobile content when we were doing subscription apps, and there was you'd have someone sell. We would have Joke of the Day as a subscription app on Comedy Central, and then somebody else would have Joke of the Day as a subscription app from who knows who this person is, and they would trick you into charging $6.99 a day, and you have to triple opt out of this thing through some convoluted, mechanism to make sure you're not getting ripped off. And there was a lot of that happening in the early days of mobile. So like, I see a lot of that now as like technology is shifting more into like the NFT space and the crypto space, which I think is inevitable. But that time for content was really, really similar. Just that we didn't have social media to sort of amplify voices around it.
After Spike and Comedy Central, you worked at MTV for a while. What was your role like there?
That was great. So at MTV, I was the executive producer for, initially I came on to do, it was just called the shows team, which meant the shows on the network, which was every show on the channel outside of the tent poles, meaning the VMAs and movie awards, which had a complete separate team for those events. That was great. I mean, we were doing the same thing: apps, games, original series, behind the scenes, working much more closely than I had at Comedy and Spike with the showrunners, and the on-air development teams to create all the content you would see for every single show on the network. It was pretty expansive, and then my role there grew very quickly to include the online virtual team, online games, and then eventually MTV Geek and MTV Comics. So I had a pretty large group, and we got to do, at the time, it's, looking back, it's one of those things where it's like sad that none of that's there anymore online. Obviously, the industry changed, but the stuff that we had up there at the time, that was a really special time, I think, in online content.
That's a super cool experience. What was it like to work with the showrunners to think about, all the different content that's being produced and where consumers can access it?
That was awesome. I mean, some of my, my best experiences there were working on shows like Teen Wolf and Jersey Shore. Working directly with Jeff Davis on Teen Wolf was awesome. These showrunners were really excited and collaborative. No one was precious about anything. It was mostly new shows. Something like Jersey Shore obviously was a massive hit, but we were working on it before people thought it would even have this first season would survive, right? Very early on. So, the showrunners always they understood the value that the digital teams would bring. So it was pretty easy to, have them on board with all these crazy ideas we'd pitch. So it was very collaborative. Like, we'd come in with a laundry list of things we want to do. And then it would basically be like, well, what's feasible? That doesn't interrupt actually producing a show. So outside of that, that was literally the only requirement we ever really had, was what can we do or not do? As long as, we still have to shoot this show in 10 weeks in this location with these actors, and we can't break them for these days, and they have work, or for the reality show, it's a little bit more flexible than the scripted. But yeah, it was awesome.
And you mentioned MTV Comics, which I believe you started. So how did that get kicked off the ground?
So my supervisor at the time, my office was filled with toys and comics. So, and then at Spike, specifically Comedy Central, I kind of worked a little bit with people who were like on the fringes of comics, but at Spike we did a lot. So I wrote and produced and directed Stanley's Ringtones, and produced and directed Rob Kirkman's Battle Pope animated series. Did some work with Arcana Comics, some work with some of the Marvel guys, and obviously Spike had the Scream Awards. So was much more involved in the comic space in my time at Spike. And then once I went over to MTV, I still had all those connections, and we would produce original content sometimes. It would, we would kind of reach back out to companies I'd worked with previously for something. So, we did, the company's not around anymore, but the World Leaders Entertainment, who were was the original animation company behind Venture Brothers before they closed up and moved to Titmouse. They were the ones who produced the Battle Pope series, right? So if we needed animation done, we would always lean back into my contacts, because the MTV team was always very internal, and we did have inside awesome team of inside producers, directors, editors, internal team. But we'd be able to leverage the connections that I had developed in the 4 years in it was called the Entertainment Group, where Comedy and Spike set the organization. So bringing all that in, and then seeing sort of an office full of toys and comics. And one thing I think that really sort of helped with that is that it's downstairs. I have a big rack from DC Comics that they sent me once, because we bought for Comedy Central Mobile, for the Joke of the Day or one of those apps, we bought the back covers of all the DC books 1 month, or to see how it would drive subscriptions. And they sent over like a rack full of stuff as a thank you. So I always had it in my office. So, my boss at the time was, well, we were growing into all these new areas as a brand. It was a real period of growth for MTV specifically, especially when ratings go up. everything else, everything kind of, all boats rise when that happens, right? Um, and asked, what could we do with this? And I was like, well, if you're serious, um, I'll put something together. So MTV Comics came to birth with MTV Geek hand in hand. Those two concepts were in one business plan.
From there, you got that off the ground, and from there, how did you make your transition over to Webtoon?
Oh, I left MTV, God, back late, the very end of 2013. We had made this, and then we had made the decision to move to Los Angeles. So I can't really discuss what I came out here for initially, because it didn't launch. And it's with well-known people in the space. But I was doing something here, and we had run into a stumbling block with funding that was lined up and looked like was going to fall through. And when that happened, it was like, okay, I got to interview for a job. So, I had a few different opportunities at the time. I had never heard of Webtoon. They had barely been here, and got introduced to them through Stanley's company, having done so much work with Stan over the years. So they put me in touch with Webtoon, and kind of on a just, conversation with my wife is like, I have an opportunity at like this huge digital company that everybody knows, this massive entertainment brand that everybody knows, and these are really cool gigs for this thing that no one's ever heard of. But if it's what they're describing to me in the interviews, could be something special and new, and that's more exciting to me. And so I accepted the offer.
So at that time, like you said, obviously Webtoon has been big in East Asia and in Korea, especially. It was starting to gain popularity in the West, but it was still very new. Do you mind giving us a little bit more context about where Webtoon was historically at this time?
Oh, in the US, I mean, no one had heard of it. It had, I can't remember if we even had 10,000 daily active users when I started. I mean, it was really, really small, smaller than, the smallest website we ever had at Viacom. When I left, we were up to 1 million DAU, in that 3.5-year period that I was there. So, no, it was, it was really small. It was mostly titles that were localized from the Korean app, which is actually a completely separate build. The Korean app and the English app are just different apps, with different content. There was some originals happening in the US through members of the Korean team, just kind of reaching out to creators and sort of off, like anybody who they would see be popular on like Tapas or Comico. No, Comico was one of the titles overseas, the apps overseas. It was Go Comics, and reaching out to those creators and just offering them deals to come over exclusively. So there were a handful of creators in the app already, but I was brought on specifically to grow the US market and bring on more creators from build up what became now is called Canvas, but then was called the Challenge League, which was one of my first tasks. Was the internal tasks was like, we can't call it that, and bring in more and more existing like Western creators.
So is your sort of business goal to grow like the usage of Webtoons in the US?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That was specifically what I was tasked with. Yeah.
In terms of a metric standpoint, what sort of metrics did you look at to kind of guide you to make sure you were on track here?
The overall goal was always DAU, just DAU, DAU, DAU. How many people are using the app every day? It's fairly similar with a lot of sort of tech startups too, right? Then individually, if you look at like weekly unique readers, it's no different than you would selling a comic in your local store. How many people are picking it up, looking at it? That's the metric for success. Does it have eyeballs or not? Those were, just from like a KPI perspective, that was pretty much it. Do these titles have readership, and is the DAU going north, right?
Yeah, that is not an easy task. And 100 to 1,000x. Would you say it ended at 1 million DAUs by
When
the
I
time
left,
you
it
left?
was about 1 million. Yeah, we're at 1 million.
Million DAUs, which is crazy. So you had this behemoth of a task. I mean, how did you approach your job? What sort of things did you start to do, and where did you begin?
I mean, the most immediate challenge wasn't about content. I think it was more about like the brand itself, and the impression of the brand in the US and how to position it properly, um, to resonate with a youth US audience. And then I had made a decision early on, to focus on a female audience, just because the US comics market, and those numbers are US only. So like and the US comic market was so heavily dominated by male content, as we all know, that there was clearly space, and there were certainly moments and examples of flashes of like, wait, women like this? You know, and having been at MTV, that's a network that actually skews female. So, I sort of already had my head there.
Mm.
That was one way to do it. The other was just sort of update the brand. Was like, all right, we can't call it Challenge League. That sounds like a sports, fantasy league or something, right? Um, we don't have any way to even message in the app, what it means to go from a challenge league to, at the time, a featured, quote unquote, featured series. What does that path look like? What does monetization look like? It's confusing. So a lot of it was buttoning that up, like rebranding it Discover, me just boots on the ground at a million conventions, developed a handbook, to hand out to creators that literally explain the brand. It was bringing on a PR agency to start to set up interviews and kind of establish what we were. Use some of my connections to legitimize Webtoon in the US. So that was Stan Lee, Mark Silvestri, like partnerships like that really early on, like bring in some contacts of mine to really just help solidify, like, okay, this is real. I mean, there were a lot of panels with creators who were first approached before I came on who were like, is it is it a scam? Right? Like, that kind of mentality, because it was, they'd get a mysterious email from someone they haven't heard of on the other side of the planet. They hadn't heard of the app, and they're like, we'll pay you all this money to put your thing in there, and here's a contract, and the contract's weird. And, it's so it was there. Webtoon wasn't big enough to like have to like combat like any kind of a scam mentality. It was more just like establishing this thing exists and it's real. And a lot of that was just me walking around conventions too, and like talking to people I know. Here's what I'm doing now. Here's my card. When you're ready to talk about doing something, would love to work with you on an original title. And a lot of that too is, that took time too, because, creators rightfully are fickle about where their content might live, and sort of resistant to be like, I'm going to be on this thing no one's heard of. I don't want my stuff there. I want to publish an image, right? Like, so it took a little time to like build that up, and that was a lot of convention presences. We did a really large exhibition at San Diego Comic-Con my first year, just being a few months in. We pulled that together fast, and took over. If you've been to San Diego, there's a restaurant called Lou and Mickey's that faces the convention center. There's photos of this online, you can find easily. We took over that space for a weekend, and then we did like a panel just for press, where it was like Stan Lee, Michelle Phan, the YouTube, who's got a massive YouTube channel, makeup line, CB Sapolsky, because we were doing some stuff with Disney, and Mark Silvestri, because we were doing a new Cyberforce series, and we did that panel in the venue only for press. Just those kinds of things to like try to just push the brand into the space. And then the second part of that, I think, was like not a redesign, but kind of just pushing what's the aesthetic we're going for here, in what's the look of a brand that resonates. Because if you look at the really old Webtoon logo and the brand itself on the old sides, it felt very cartoony. It didn't feel young, it felt childish, which that style works in Japan and Korea, right? But in the United States, that's not. It just skewed way too young. So it was just pushing like, here's a rebrand. Here's the kind of fonts that are going to work. Here's the kind of messaging. Here's how we have to structure some of the language, and a lot of cleanup, right? Like a lot of the site just haven't been reviewed by an English speaking editor before. So it was just fixing up stuff to just try and like, okay, now it's here. Now it's real. Now we're clean. Now people understand what it is. Now it's not called Challenge League, it's called Discover. Now people have this book. Now we're going to partner with Patreon and DeviantArt. We're going to announce those things. Okay, those are brands creators know and respect, and just kind of like one after the other, after the other, after the other, until we just had the thing in a place where after about a year, it was like, okay, what's Webtoon? And people start to like come to us and ask questions instead of just push, 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 right? And eventually it turned the corner from most of the marketing being creator marketing to being consumer marketing.
Interesting. So it seems like it was more of, a death by a thousand cuts kind of thing where you did a bunch of different things that built on one another rather than one massive thing that swayed people's minds. And by people here, I mean the creators specifically.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was you have to get everything in place. There was no sort of just, turn on the lights. We did some contests, right? But the contests alone still had a cap on how many people would enter them. And even those contests were really great opportunities and legit, you'd still go into a DeviantArt, message board and see people, talking smack about them, kind of have to go back out and re-message like, no. You're going to keep your rights. You're going to get paid really well. There's always whenever there's a contest, it's always they're looking for free work. And it's like, well, no, we're going to give you a bunch of money. And if the thing is good, this is what you're using to pitch it. You still have to pitch your stuff to Image, right? And create a bunch of pages. They're not just like, hey, person I've never heard of, give me an idea and we'll make your comic, right? Like, so just that kind of mentality.
So it's one thing to, get the brand in a place where things are set for you to start to produce content that resonates with the US audience. But now you have the task of actually, picking and deciding what stories you're going to kind of back, what you're going to develop. I mean, I'm sure it was incredibly challenging, but also a ton of fun. So what was that like?
It was awesome. I mean, I got to reach out to lots of creators who I've always wanted to work with, a lot of creators who I'd previously worked with at MTV. We had lined up for MTV comics. Those like Sanford Green's 1000 was an MTV comic. Eventually, we brought it over to Webtoon, and then won Best Web Comic at the Ringo Awards. Same thing with like a Dean Haspiel, who won the previous year Best Web Comic at the Ringo Awards for the Red Hook. We had done a partnership with his digital studio called Activate with MTV Geek. So it was a lot of like getting to really explore in a more proper full-time comics role what could be done with all these creators who I always sort of wanted to work with, and got content off the ground to some level at MTV, and leverage all of the relationships that we had built over the years at MTV Geek, because that was a very, very big site that had about 1.5 million monthly average users by the time I left. So that piece was a lot of fun, a little bit stressful in that it was same thing, like education.
Yeah.
A lot of, obviously, the second piece of the brand issue aside is vertical scroll versus print, right? And that's a whole hour-long conversation of its own. But and then curating more content out of Discover, as it was called at the time, like pulling and putting together more sort of just processes in terms of like how we're going to greenlight content, what we're looking for. And it became something where it got to be it was a little bit of a free-for-all for a while there in the beginning, and just sort of structuring that so that we had like, eventually it was like, well, we're greenlighting enough content, what is the marketing, we are reliant on the marketing team to some extent, and we had a great marketing team there at the time, and it was, well, let's let the marketing team greenlight one series every time we do a round of greenlights. And that's how Lore Olympus got greenlit. The marketing team chose Lore Olympus, which now is one of the biggest, most popular comics, period, digital and print.
It's one thing for you to go to your existing relationships and be like, okay, I know these people are going to kick ass, like they're going to come and make a great webtoon for our platform. You mentioned how do we look for something, and it's interesting that you worked with marketing to pick Lore Olympus. So I'm curious, like, what would you look for to be like, okay, this is really going to resonate with the audience that we've started to understand from the marketing perspective?
So on platform, it's easier, because when you're looking through Discover or Canvas, you can see how frequently they're updating. Do they have traction? Do they understand the format? Is there like already a basic idea here that works? You can do a talent evaluation, on the art and the writing. So it's much easier to see something when it's already being uploaded and gaining traction and be like, well, that clearly works. So let's pull that. So, pulling content off Discover, and obviously, a lot of the huge hits have come from there, like Let's Play. came right out of Discover, but it was evident really early on how talented, Leanne is, right? And the series got traction very quickly. That's not as hard as pulling content from other sources. So then, the other place we get content was me, no joke, like scouring artist alleys, buying people's books that are unpublished or talking to creators. That's how I met Monica Gallagher, right? I had bought, oh God, I'm blanking on the name of it now. She had done a series of short comics that were actually already vertical, just page turns. So, just seeing that in New York Comic Con, I picked it up from her, and then later on, reached out when we were looking for an artist for a project that eventually became Good with Sex. And in the meantime, we had done Assassin Roommate. Yeah, it's more about like, is there consistency in what they're doing and what they're uploading? Is there an art style that we think is going to resonate with a 14 to 24-year-old audience? And then, I would maintain a matrix of, genres and content types that we're looking for, and say like, all right, we got to plug these holes, right? So like, all right, do we have enough romance? Do we have enough action? And, even though we're intentionally skewing female, eventually we wanted to like, steer the ship back into like, all right, now we want to be much broader and all encompassing in terms of genre and format. Well, not format. Format's always vertical, but in terms of genre. And I guess between like short form comedy and long form narrative, which leads heavily long form narrative, because that's easier to gain traction when you have a hook at the end of every episode to get back to. And then it was, again, just education with creators. A lot of it was, the creators who uploaded to Discover have more of a natural knack for this, I think, because they are already in it. So they're already used to reading everything on the platform because they're already there all the time. And they see how to build an episode up with a proper, basically, hook, right? So in terms of like pacing and cliffhangers, it's the same reason why we all wanted to binge Breaking Bad, and why we binge Ozark or whatever it is that we're watching on TV is, what's that cliffhanger? What are you teasing? And then how are you structuring your story from week to week? Training the editorial team on that with a big board of, your A storyline, your B storyline, your C storyline, when this element gets introduced, and just running through all that.
One last thing on Webtoon before we move over to Rocketship. You mentioned the Patreon integration, and you talk about, or have talked about the importance of providing, more financial opportunity for Webtoon creators. So how did that integration come about? And, what was like the genesis of it?
That was very early on. So that was part of the challenge, what I'd call the Challenge League problem, was there was a branding, messaging, and monetization issue with what Challenge League was. And it was, and looking across the board, it was like, well, if I upload here, I can see, if I upload on Comixology Submit, I can see exactly how much money I can make. I understand how it gets to market. And the issue we had with monetization and the Patreon integration was like, well, we don't have a way to monetize content. There were no ads in the app at the time. So the app wasn't generating any revenue. This was all loss leader, the entire push, for years. So for almost my entire time there, it was just a loss leader. The whole app, the whole enterprise was a loss leader. But we can't be asking people to upload here without any idea of how they can make money, only with the vagueness of, I can go to featured and then I know I can make money, but I don't even know how that happens. So the idea of basically a tip cup idea, or what Patreon was already doing, was like, well, what if we can integrate something like Patreon into the app? So at least they can say they get this many, you can see, right, we can put the button right on the page, which we did. And we worked closely with Patreon. I'd go up there in San Francisco, and, they built an API, we put it into the app so we could display how many patrons you have, and you can support your favorite creators. And then on top of that, we launched a program and advertised this heavily. And same thing, I would go around, this would be in the booklets I'd hand out, and I would do panels at all the conventions about this, was how if you upload and you hit these certain tiers, we will just pay you money. So, there were creators making $500 a chapter or a month or whatever it was at the time. I think the initial pool that we put out there, we didn't even touch this number. It was like $3.5 million or something. And a bucket of money for creators to just go get. And that's what really helped build that, because, without the Patreon piece, I think Challenge League, no matter what we called it and how we branded it, would still sort of flounder, because it was always going to be like, well, I don't understand how I can make money here.
Well, from there, you spent 3 years at Webtoon and you start your own thing, Rocketship. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the problems you're trying to solve for comic creators with Rocketship?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that was, sort of painfully evident um, when I was at Webtoon is that a lot of the industry still didn't respect it at the same level as print comics, which was really frustrating, right? Because it, now that myth has been dispelled, right? But like at the time, it was no one believed these titles were at the same level, we'll say, as anything coming out from the Western traditional publishers, and therefore it was really difficult to get Western publishers to think about webtoons as something to publish. At the same time, Webtoon internally had no interest in print publishing. I'd brought it up a million times and was pushing it hard, but couldn't get traction internally either. So the company didn't want to do it. That was one thing. And the print publishers weren't interested in it. And even outside of Webtoon, there have already been hundreds of massive hit webcomics at the same tier as the top series on Webtoon. Like a lot of them, the Dinosaur comics and Heart and Brain and Cyrus Scribbles were already massive hits. Also, well, I think Heart and Brain came along while we were there, but you know what I mean? Like there's tons and tons of, Order of the Stick, right? That was when I was at MTV Geek, that did like a 1 point something million Kickstarter, if I recall. So there always have been these massive hit webcomics that just don't seem to be taken seriously by print publishers or put into print. And then the creators themselves, especially the webcomics creators, by and large, there's certainly those who, like Nick Selleck, who build their own empires, right? But don't have their head around like, all right, well, I want to put this into print. What goes into that? How do I pitch it? Can I do it myself or any of that? So it was sort of, kind of providing those services. And then the third problem was the Webtoon series specifically, even though we publish other webcomics outside of Webtoon, but like the Webtoon series were by and large done in this vertical format. And reformatting that for print is no joke. It's a real challenge. So again, that's a service we provide as a publisher to creators who already have that there. They don't have to do it themselves unless if they want to, by all means, go for it. But it's something we do, and we do a lot of it.
You mentioned that a lot of these publishers will take a webcomic and almost not take it seriously. Why do you think that is? What is it about the mentality of these publishers that kind of stop them from taking these very successful pieces of IP or stories and not printing them?
Well, I think that's changed in the last 3 years. So I don't think that's the case anymore. I mean, everyone has seen how successful the Kickstarters have been for Let's Play and for a lot of the other properties we put out. Everybody's seen how successful things like Sarah Scribbles, Sarah Anderson's books have been, like Fangs, right? People see what the Sedgicks are doing with Top Cow. Those all start as webcomics and they're top sellers. I think they post those primarily on DeviantArt, but they throw them up everywhere. And obviously Lore Olympus is a bestseller. So I think there's a lot of there's a lot of proof because Rocketship exists and has sort of been explaining that. I've been out there talking about this and doing interviews and articles about it, panels at Comic-Cons. It's sort of, oh, okay, this is sort of real now, and creators are talking about it. And people now look back at something like, we published The Awkward Yeti, Lars, The Awkward Yeti, but he already published his Heart and Brain with Anders McNeil. And it's like, wait, Nick's a New York Times bestselling author already? So, it's just kind of like, I think we're past that now. So, but at the beginning of it, I think it was the same problem as it was in the industry. It was just, oh, it's a webcomic. Oh, they've already read it online. It won't do well in print. And then internally at Webtoon, it was the print industry died in Korea, so it won't work here either. That's why Webtoon was born. Was print industry did die in Korea. So Webtoon became successful. Well, Dom Webtoon was first, and then Neighbor Webtoon followed. But about a year later, right? And then so that mentality was inside the company, and then outside the company was just getting publishers to pay attention to this. And then and then manga publishers obviously know you can bring successful content in from from places people aren't looking for it, but the manga industry still suffers from a lot of that. It's not taken as seriously despite the sales figures as Walking Dead's a bad example because the sales figures are high, but say Saga, right? Like, I mean, My Hero Academia outsells Saga, 1,000,001 or whatever. There's probably some ridiculous, number, but the rest of the industry is like, holds Saga. I mean, rightfully so. Saga's fantastic, but like holds Saga on a pedestal. And My Hero Academia is something that like, their kid brother reads, and it's just a niche thing, right? Despite what we all know My Hero Academia to be.
So, what do you look for in terms of creator or story when you look for someone to be a part of Rocketship? Do they come to you, or are you finding people that could be good fits?
Both. Mostly these days, we're getting submissions from existing webcomic creators now that we've been around so long and have a sizable catalog. A lot of it initially was me just chit chatting with people I've worked with in the past and saying, "Hey, we're doing this. You'd be interested." So what we're looking for, in the first 2 years was really just titles I was already intimately familiar with, and saying like, "Hey, I'd love to keep working with you. If you don't have an opportunity to print your book, here's one." uh, so that was pretty easy. Now if it's a web comic, I'd say the thing we look for is quality, right? So there's no one genre fit. We have a lot of romance books, obviously. We have sizable amount of action books. We have, Ryan Benjamin's Book Respond. We have Phoebe Nissa's and Riley Brown's Outrage. We're putting out Back Channel, which is a book I did with Andy Tong and Stan Lee. I'm going to blank on some, and Urban Animal by Justin Jordan and John Ammer. So like then we have, a series of humor books, which is Waters of the Old Spaghetti and Adventures of God and Undead Ed, and there's more coming there. So, and we're going to do more horror. I can tell you this, we haven't announced it yet, but because I saw you already interviewed him, we just signed Witch Creek Road.
Oh, awesome. We love Garth and with
I just say I saw
yeah.
you just interviewed Garth. Yeah. So we'll be putting out Witch Creek Road, but we're building more horror titles. But it's really just about like, is it really good, and does it have a home? And then outside of that, it sort of doesn't matter. Like we're not, and I'm not anti-superhero either. That just hasn't happened to been a thing, right?
We're so happy for Garth and Kenan. And before we move to our rapid fire round and close this out, what does the future of Rocketship hold?
We're launching tabletop games this year, so there's going to be a lot of that. The first two are Brothers Bond, which is based on Ryan Benjamin's Eisner-nominated series. And the second we announced in December, which is Stanley's Genesis, which is the first ever Stanley tabletop game.
Wow, that's awesome.
That I'm designing that game, and just coincidentally with Ryan, because I do a lot of work with him. Ryan and I are creating 200 original characters for that title for the game that we're working on until 1 a.m. every night these days. So there's that. We're having our largest retail release this year because we had just signed with Simon & Schuster last June. So retail is really ramping up. We just got listed in Diamond pretty recently, and got that buttoned up because Diamond had, everyone had issues with the pandemic. So everything got delayed for everybody. But so that's finally on track. We're going to have titles in foreign languages. So we'll have some announcements for that this year. I'll just tell you, there'll be a press release, but we are going to launch a separate Rocketship Kids line. It's up on our site. Our first title in that kids line is Felix the Cat, which we just signed the contract for that fairly recently. And that'll be followed by, we'll move Foxfires, which is one of our children's titles, all ages titles. That's just fantastic, into that line. And there'll be a couple other titles going in there as well. We'll have 5 or 6 titles for Rocketship Kids this year. And then, gosh, there's stuff I can't talk about.
Well, what you shared is already incredibly exciting. We will be on the lookout for more announcements. And Tom, just congrats on all of this. It's so exciting to see what you've done for the industry. And before we close, are you ready for our rapid fire round? We'll fly through this.
Yeah, go for
it. Which fictional character describes you best?
Ooh, the Noid.
The Noid. Which 3 webtoons would you take with you on a desert island?
All right, that's a loaded question because I published so many of them, so I can't. Yeah, no, I'm not answering the webtoon one. I'm sorry, I can't.
Oh no, all good.
Can I just say like 20 of them, 30 of them?
This one might be a little contentious too. Then, if you could pick a creator to have dinner with, who would it be?
Oh well, I've had dinner with every creator I work with, so that's an easy one. Who would I have dinner with that I haven't been able to have dinner with? The creator, I think it would probably have to be somebody like Alan Moore, or someone sort of old school and legendary who I've had a very lucky career in that I've gotten to work with and spend time with a lot of people in the field who I deeply admire. So it would probably just have to be somebody who's like really kind of far away from what I've done, but still has stories of the past, I think, where I could learn a lot.
What's the most memorable scene from any comic or webtoon that pops into your mind?
Webtoon, Well, only because I just read it a few days ago. Was the latest chapter of Let's Play, which was hilarious. I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but that was one of my favorites.
And then finally, if you could hang out with one fictional character, who would it be?
Ooh, that's tough. Hang out with a fictional character. Who would it be? I'll go with Bowser. from Let's Play.
Bowser. Wonderful. Well, Tom, thank you so much for taking some time. And listener, please check out rocketshipent.com. You can check out a bunch of wonderful comics there and look for any new updates, as Tom has mentioned. Tom, thanks once again.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any feedback or want to be featured as our next guest, please write to us at pixelsandpanelspod@gmail.com. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe, like, or give us a 5-star rating. See you all next week.